3 days after Christmas, my 11-year-old daughter Lily called me, her voice trembling against the freezing wind. "Mom, Grandma said I can't come inside because Brandon is opening his gifts." My heart shattered as I realized she was trekking 1.7 miles alone through the Idaho snow. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. Instead, I made a single silent phone call to Great-Aunt Ruth. 2 weeks later, the family ATM officially closed. My parents received a formal legal notice they had 60 days to vacate their $740,000 home. For the first time, I watched my father's face turn deathly pale, looking exactly like a man who had just been unplugged from his only power source. The transition from the cold, clinical reality of an eviction notice back to the warmth of a Christmas hearth felt like a fever dream, but the memory of that night remained etched in my mind with agonizing clarity. It wasn't the snow or the distance that broke me. It was the calculated cruelty of a seating chart. The Whitaker family Christmas dinner was supposed to be the pinnacle of the year, a display of suburban warmth in my parents' $740,000 Coeur d'Alene home. When Lily and I arrived, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air, and the fireplace crackled with a deceptive sense of welcome. There were 12 people gathered in the foyer, shedding heavy coats and exchanging loud, boisterous greetings. But as we moved toward the dining room, the atmosphere shifted. I counted the places set at the long mahogany table. 12 people, 11 chairs. The silence that followed was heavy. My mother Margaret smoothed her silk apron, her eyes flitting toward Lily before landing on me with a heavy performative sigh. It was the kind of sigh she usually reserved for a broken vase or a spilled glass of wine, as if my daughter's very existence was a minor irritating inconvenience she was forced to manage. "Hannah, dear," she started, her voice thin and strained. "We have a bit of a situation. Brandon has a few of his school friends coming over later to exchange gifts and, well, the table is just full. There isn't enough room for everyone to sit comfortably." I felt Lily's hand tighten in mine. At 11, she was old enough to read the subtext, but young enough to still hope for a miracle. She looked at the empty space between my brother Kevin and my father Douglas, where a chair could easily have been squeezed in. Kevin didn't even look up from his phone, where he was busy scrolling through sports betting lines. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the room. "Lily can just head back home, can't she? It's barely a 20-minute walk. It'll do her some good to get some fresh air while the men watch the game." He said it as if he were suggesting a fun stroll, completely ignoring the fact that the temperature outside had plummeted to 10 degrees and the sun had already dipped below the horizon. "It's dark out, Kevin," I said, my voice dangerously level. "And it's Christmas." "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Hannah," my father chimed in, leaning back in his armchair. He had spent the last decade living off the dividends of my great-aunt Ruth's generosity, yet he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a self-made mogul. "Brandon needs his space. He's the only grandson, the one who will carry on the name. We have to prioritize the boys today. It's just how things are." I looked down at Lily. Her eyes were already rimmed with red, her bottom lip trembling as she tried to maintain the good girl persona she had worked so hard to cultivate. She didn't throw a tantrum. She didn't scream. She just looked up at me with a heartbreakingly small voice. "Mom, can I please stay? I can sit on the floor. I'll stay in the corner. I won't get in Brandon's way." The desperation in her voice was a physical blow to my chest. Before I could speak, my mother shrugged, a casual, dismissive movement that felt like a door slamming shut. "Brandon needs the living room for his friends, Lily. There's just no extra space for you tonight. You understand, don't you? Family is about balance, and right now, Brandon is the priority." In that moment, the scales fell from my eyes. For years, I had been the reliable one. I was the senior payroll administrator who fixed their tax errors. I was the one who bought the groceries when Kevin forgot his wallet. I was the ATM that never asked for a receipt. But as I stood there holding my daughter's shaking hand, I realized that to them, We weren't family. We were service providers. Lily wasn't a grandchild to them. She was a guest who had overstayed her welcome in a house that wouldn't even exist without the bloodline she shared with Ruth Caldwell. They were choosing a teenage bully and his friends over a cold, lonely 11-year-old girl simply because of a backward preference for the male heir. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply reached for Lily's coat. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice cold enough to match the Idaho winter. "There isn't enough room in this house for both of us." As we walked out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth and the smell of turkey behind, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My parents thought they were the masters of this domain, but they had forgotten one crucial detail: they didn't own the dirt they stood on. I dialed a number I knew by heart. "Aunt Ruth," I said when the line picked up. "It's Hannah. I think it's time we discuss the future of the Coeur d'Alene property." The drive home was the quietest 20 minutes of my life, a stark contrast to the boisterous laughter echoing behind the heavy oak doors of my parents' house. I didn't argue with Margaret, and I didn't waste my breath trying to shame Kevin. Engaging with them in that moment would have only forced Lily to witness a domestic war she wasn't equipped to handle. Instead, I focused on the mechanical precision of buttoning her coat, tucking her scarf tight against the biting Idaho wind, and guiding her toward the driveway. "We're leaving Lily," I whispered, my voice a forced calm that tasted like copper in my mouth. "We don't need to stay in a place that doesn't want us." As we stepped onto the porch, the muffled sound of Brandon's predatory cheering drifted through the glass. I heard Kevin's booming voice praising the boys' new gaming console, a gift likely bought with the loan I'd given my mother last month for her medical bills. The injustice of it was a physical weight, but I kept my eyes forward. The crunch of snow under our boots was the only sound until we reached the car. As I buckled Lily into the passenger seat, she looked up at me, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold and her eyes swimming with a confusion that broke my heart. "Mom," she asked, her voice small and trembling. "Did I do something wrong? Was I too loud? I promised I'd be quiet." I froze. My hand gripped white knuckle tight on the steering wheel. That was the moment the last thread of my patience snapped. It wasn't just that they had excluded her. They had made an innocent 11-year-old girl believe she was a fundamental error in their holiday equation. "No, Lily. Never," I said, leaning over to cup her face. My thumb brushed away a stray tear. "You are the best part of this family. They are people who have forgotten how to see what's truly valuable. I promise you right now that I will never ever let you have to beg for a seat at a table again. Not in this family, and not anywhere else." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't quite believe me yet. As we pulled out of the driveway, the $740,000 house, shrinking in the rearview mirror, the exhaustion finally claimed her. The emotional toll of being rejected by her own grandparents was too much. By the time we hit the main road, she had drifted into a fitful sleep, her small hands still clutching a tin of Christmas butter cookies she had picked out specifically for her grandmother, a gift that now sat unopened and unwanted on her lap. When we reached our modest apartment, I carried her inside. The contrast was jarring. My home didn't have a grand fireplace or a mahogany table for 12, but it was warm, and every inch of it belonged to us. I made her a mug of thick, extra sweet hot chocolate with a mountain of marshmallows sitting on the edge of her bed until the cocoa was finished and her breathing turned deep and rhythmic. I smoothed her hair, watching the way her eyelashes fluttered in her sleep, and felt a cold, crystalline resolve settle in my chest. I walked into the kitchen, the silence of the night magnifying the ticking of the wall clock. My phone sat on the counter, a black mirror reflecting my own tired, determined face. For years I had played the role of the peacemaker. I had been the senior payroll administrator who balanced everyone else's books while they spent money they didn't earn. I had protected my parents from the consequences of their own greed because I thought that's what a good daughter did. But a good mother protects her child. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Ruth Caldwell. Aunt Ruth was 83 years old and possessed a mind like a legal brief, sharp, unforgiving, and rooted in an old-school sense of merit. She was the one who had funded the Whitaker lifestyle, holding the deeds and the trusts that kept my father in golf clubs and my mother in silk. She hated waste, and she loathed cruelty even more. I glanced at the clock. It was late, but Ruth was a night owl who preferred the company of her ledger books to sleep. I pressed dial. Hannah? The voice on the other end was gravelly but alert. It's nearly midnight. Is something wrong with the girl? Lily is fine now, Aunt Ruth. I said, my voice steady for the first time all evening. But we need to talk about the house in Coeur d'Alene, and we need to talk about who actually deserves to live in it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Ruth shifting in her high-backed chair, the gears of the family matriarch beginning to turn. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Hannah, Ruth said quietly. Tell me everything. The hierarchy in the Whitaker household was as rigid as a military command, though far less honorable. My brother Kevin was the golden boy, the perennial entrepreneur, whose light was always just about to break over the horizon. I, on the other hand, was the fixer, the invisible scaffolding that kept the family structure from collapsing under the weight of its own entitlement. For years I had accepted this role with a quiet, martyred stoicism. When my father Douglas decided to take early retirement, at 56, a polite way of saying he'd grown tired of the 40-hour work week, the financial burden shifted onto my shoulders. As a senior payroll administrator, I saw the world in black and red, in credits and debits. My personal ledger for them was a bloodbath. I began sending $1,450 every single month to cover their property taxes and homeowners insurance. I told myself it was for their security, but over 7 years that help evolved into a total drain of $142,000. That figure didn't just cover the essentials, it swallowed up Kevin's emergencies. My mother's sudden medical scares that magically disappeared once the check cleared, and the constant revolving door of credit card debt they accumulated living a lifestyle they hadn't earned. Meanwhile, Kevin lived in the finished basement like a 38-year-old king in a subterranean palace. He had been preparing for a startup for 12 years, a venture that seemed to mostly involve high-speed internet and expensive sports betting apps. 2 years ago, when he lost $27,000 in a single weekend on a parlay gone wrong, my mother didn't call it a crisis. She called it an unfortunate accident, a bit of bad luck for a boy with a big heart. She even had the audacity to ask me for a bridge loan to keep him from losing his car. The disparity wasn't just financial, it was emotional. Every Christmas and birthday, the living room transformed into a showcase of favoritism. Brandon, Kevin's son, would be showered with the latest gaming consoles, designer sneakers, and mountain bikes. Lily, my sweet, observant daughter, would usually be handed a $25 gift card to a bookstore or a pair of clearance rack pajamas. When Lily's eyes would well up at the obvious slight, my mother would offer that sharp, familiar titter of a laugh. "Oh, Hannah, she's just so sensitive," Margaret would say, waving a hand dismissively. "She needs to toughen up. She's exactly like you were at that age, always making a scene out of nothing." I had spent my entire life believing that nothing. I had been conditioned to think that my feelings were an inconvenience, and that my daughter's feelings were a secondary concern to the ego of the Whitaker men. I thought I was paying for peace. I thought I was buying a seat at a table that was never truly mine. But as I sat in the dark kitchen after that final freezing Christmas walk, the numbers began to align in a way they never had before. As a payroll expert, I knew that every contract has a clause, and every debt eventually comes due. The Whitaker family lived in a $740,000 house in Coeur d'Alene, with a wraparound porch and a view of the pines. They walked through those halls with the swagger of owners dictating who was welcome and who was an intruder. They treated the property like an ancestral castle that Brandon would one day inherit. What they had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps what they had deluded themselves into ignoring, was the legal reality of the deed. My father hadn't bought that house. He hadn't even finished paying for it. After a disastrous business pivot 20 years ago, Great Aunt Ruth had stepped in to save them from foreclosure. She didn't just give them the money, she bought the debt. The house didn't belong to Douglas and Margaret Whitaker. It belonged to the Ruth Caldwell Revocable Trust. And in the eyes of the law, my parents weren't homeowners. They were guests. Guests who had just kicked the wrong person out into the snow. The silence that stretched across the phone line after I finished recounting the night's events was heavier than any argument. Aunt Ruth didn't gasp, and she didn't offer empty platitudes. She was a woman of ledgers and legacies, and I could almost hear her processing the moral bankruptcy of her own kin. "Hannah?" she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Did I hear you correctly? They sat there in a house I paid for eating food you likely bought and told an 11-year-old child to walk nearly 2 miles in the dark through the Idaho snow." "Yes, Aunt Ruth," I replied, my voice finally cracking. Because Brandon needed space for his friends. "Wait there," she commanded. "I'm sending a car for you and Lily. We aren't doing this over the phone." An hour later, Lily was tucked into a guest suite in Ruth's sprawling, impeccably kept estate, and I was sitting in the study. The room smelled of old paper and expensive wax. Ruth didn't offer me tea. She stood up with a surprisingly fluid grace for an 83-year-old and walked toward a heavy floor-to-ceiling painting. She swung it aside to reveal a concealed wall safe. With practiced fingers, she dialed the combination. When the heavy steel door clicked open, she pulled out a thick, leather-bound accordion file. She laid it on the mahogany desk between us, the gold lettering glinting under the lamp. The Caldwell Family Trust. "Your father thinks he's a homeowner, Hannah." Ruth said, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "He spent 20 years acting like a patriarch while living on my sufferance. 9 years ago, when his consulting business folded for the third time, I didn't just bail him out. I absorbed the property into the trust to protect it from his creditors." She began laying out documents like a general preparing for a siege. There it was, the deed to the $740,000 Coeur d'Alene house, held entirely by the trust. Beside it lay the quarterly statements for the $1.8 million investment portfolio that fueled the family's lifestyle. "I am the sole trustee," Ruth explained, her finger tapping the signature line. "I have the absolute power to appoint, remove, or change beneficiaries at my sole discretion. Your parents have lived there under a tenancy at will agreement. They pay no rent, and in return I expected them to maintain the integrity of this family." She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "I gave them that roof because I believed they were building a home for the next generation. But a home that excludes a child because of her gender or her mother's utility isn't a family, it's a country club. And the membership fees have just become too expensive." The weight of what she was suggesting began to settle in my stomach. For years I had been the shield between my parents and the cold reality of their choices. If Ruth moved forward, that shield would be gone. "Hannah," she said, leaning forward, "you've spent your life being the fixer. You've paid $142,000 of your own hard-earned money to keep a roof over the heads of people who wouldn't give your daughter a chair. Do you want to keep fixing their mistakes, or do you want to protect Lily?" I thought of Lily's red-rimmed eyes. I thought of her asking if she had done something wrong by simply existing. The guilt I had carried for years, the good daughter complex, evaporated, replaced by the fierce, cold clarity of a mother. "I want to protect my daughter," I said firmly. "I want her to know she is never an afterthought." Ruth nodded, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "Good. Then we are in agreement." She didn't hesitate. She picked up the landline on her desk and dialed a number she clearly knew by heart. It was 1:15 a.m., but for the man on the other end, Ruth Caldwell was the kind of client you answered for at any hour. Arthur. It's Ruth. Sorry for the hour, but I need you to earn your retainer. I want to exercise my power of appointment regarding the Coeur d'Alene property. I'm revoking the residency of Douglas and Margaret Whitaker immediately. I also want a full audit of the monthly stipends paid to Kevin Whitaker. She paused, listening to the lawyer on the other end, then glanced at me. And Arthur draft a 60-day notice to quit. I want it served by a process server on Monday morning, not by mail. I want someone to hand it to them while they're having breakfast. She hung up the phone and looked at the $1.8 million ledger. Now, Hannah, let's talk about how we're going to restructure Lily's future. The cold, professional atmosphere of Daniel Mercer's office at Mercer and Hale Estate Law was a world away from the emotional chaos of my parents' living room. Mr. Mercer, a man who spoke in the precise, clipped tones of someone used to dismantling fortunes, didn't look surprised to see us. He had been the architect of the Caldwell family's legal defenses for decades, and he knew exactly where the skeletons were buried. He adjusted his glasses and laid out a thick document, his finger tracing a specific paragraph, highlighted in yellow. Section 7B of the Caldwell Revocable Trust. He began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. This is what we call a power of appointment clause. It grants the grantor, in this case, Ruth, the absolute unilateral right to redirect the distribution of trust assets at any time, for any reason, without the consent of the current beneficiaries. Ruth sat beside me, her spine as straight as a poker. Read the amendment, Daniel Ham, she commanded. Under the new terms, Mercer continued, Douglas and Margaret Whitaker are being removed as life tenants and primary beneficiaries of the Coeur d'Alene property. Effective immediately, the equitable title of the residence is being transferred to a subtrust for a single minor beneficiary, Lily Whitaker, age 11. I felt a dizzying rush of relief. The $740,000 house, the very walls my parents used to exclude my daughter, now legally belonged to her. Because Lily was a minor, the document named me, Hannah Whitaker, as the successor trustee and property manager. I wasn't just the fixer anymore. I was the gatekeeper. The legal machinery moved with terrifying efficiency. Over the next 10 days, we met with title officers and filed updated deeds at the Kootenai County Recorder's Office. The public record was quietly changed. On paper, the Whitaker family home had vanished. In its place was the Lily Whitaker Heritage Trust. While the lawyers were busy, I began my own process of unplugging. I sat at my laptop late one Tuesday night, my finger hovering over the mouse. For 84 consecutive months, I had authorized a recurring transfer of $1,450 to my father's checking account. I looked at the active status of the transfer, the money that paid for the roof over their heads, the heat in their vents, and the insurance on their cars. With one firm click, I selected Cancel Recurring Payment. The silence that followed in my apartment felt like a victory. That was $17,400 a year back in Lily's college fund. I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was no longer subsidizing my own daughter's exclusion. The irony of the situation was almost painful when I checked social media the following afternoon. Kevin Ever, the entrepreneur, had posted a series of photos on Facebook. He was leaning against a rugged, slightly rusted Ford F-150. New year, new whip, big things coming for the startup this year. $9,800 well spent. Hard work pays off. I knew that $9,800 hadn't come from hard work. It had likely come from a personal loan my father had taken out against his perceived equity in the house equity that had officially ceased to exist 48 hours prior. Kevin was celebrating a purchase made with ghost money, while Brandon sat in his room playing video games in a house that now belonged to the cousin they had forced to walk home in the snow. My parents remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware. They continued to post photos of their Sunday roasts and Brandon's sports trophies, acting as though they were the masters of their domain. They truly believed that the house was theirs by divine right, a permanent fortress of their own making. They didn't realize that the foundation had already been dug out from under them. They were living in a glass house, and the person who owned the glass had just handed me the hammer. February 14th is usually a day for declarations of love, but in 2026 it became the day of a very different kind of declaration. At exactly 9 a.m., a professional process server pulled into the driveway of the Coeur d'Alene house. My parents were likely mid-breakfast perhaps discussing Brandon's next expensive extracurricular activity or Kevin's business prospects when the doorbell rang. The envelope they received wasn't a Valentine. It was a formal legal notice from Mercer and Hale Estate Law, and it was written in the cold, unyielding language of property rights. The document was devastatingly clear. The residence at 1142 Ponderosa Drive was the sole property of the Caldwell Family Trust. It explicitly stated that Douglas and Margaret Whitaker held zero equity in the home. Furthermore, it informed them that the trust's primary beneficiary had been updated, and as of that morning their tenancy at will had been revoked. They were given exactly 60 days to vacate the premises. The fallout was instantaneous. My phone began vibrating on my desk at work so violently it nearly slid off the edge. I ignored the first 3 calls, finishing a payroll run for the hospital staff, before finally stepping into the break room to answer the 4th. "Hannah? What the hell is this?" My father's voice exploded through the receiver. He sounded breathless, his usual arrogance replaced by a high-pitched, frantic vibration. "Some man just handed us a pile of lies. He claims we don't own the house. He says we have to leave. There's a massive mistake in the records, Hannah. You're the one who handles the taxes. You need to call this Mercer guy and fix this immediately." I stood by the window watching the rain hit the pavement, feeling a strange, hollow calm. "There is no mistake, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "Don't be ridiculous," he barked. "I've lived here for 20 years. This is my house. Ruth must have had a stroke or some kind of mental lapse. We need to get her to a doctor and get these papers retracted before this goes any further." "Aunt Ruth is perfectly fine," I replied. "She's actually more lucid than she's been in years. She made the decision after Christmas, Dad. After you decided Lily didn't deserve a seat at your table. After you sent an 11-year-old out into a blizzard because Brandon needed space." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. I could practically hear the gears grinding as he tried to find a way to pivot. That was a family matter. It has nothing to do with the deed. You can't let her do this, Hannah. Where are we supposed to go? Kevin's startup hasn't launched yet, and we've spent our savings." "You haven't spent your savings?" I corrected him gently. "You've spent my money, and Ruth's. And as of February 1st, my monthly transfers have stopped. I suggest you look at your bank balance." The line went dead. An hour later, Kevin tried his luck. He didn't call me. He went straight for the source. He drove his new-to-him F-150 over to Aunt Ruth's estate, likely planning to use his golden boy charm to smooth things over. But Ruth had already instructed her security gate operator that no one from the Whitaker line, save for myself and Lily, was permitted on the grounds. When he tried to call her private line, she simply glanced at the caller ID and handed the phone to her housekeeper. "Tell him I am busy reviewing the audit of his gambling debts," she said. The reality truly sank in a week later. A second notice arrived, this one from the Kootenai County District Court formalizing the eviction proceedings. This wasn't just a letter from a lawyer anymore. It was a matter of public record. For the first time in his life, my father realized he wasn't the king of the castle. He was a man who had been unplugged from his power source. I heard from a family cousin that my mother had spent the entire day crying in the kitchen while my father sat in his darkened study staring at the floor. The house that had been their weapon of exclusion was now the cage from which they were being expelled. They had spent years treating us like uninvited guests in their lives. Now the law was treating them exactly the same way. The following weeks were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. My phone became a battlefield, buzzing incessantly with dozens of calls and notifications every single day. The family ATM had been disconnected and the customers were getting desperate. Margaret, my mother, was the first to deploy the guilt. Her voicemails were long, breathy performances filled with the sound of stifled sobs. "Hannah, darling, we're family," she would plead, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. "Families don't do this to each other. We don't use lawyers and court orders to settle misunderstandings. Think of your poor father's heart. Think of the shame this is bringing to our name." Then came Kevin's contribution. His messages were less poetic and more predatory. "Be real, Hannah," one text read. "Lily is 11. She's a kid. She doesn't need a 4-bedroom house in Coeur d'Alene. She needs her family together. Give the house back to mom and dad and I'll help you find a nice condo closer to the hospital. Don't be greedy." I didn't reply to a single one. I was busy working my shifts at the Spokane Medical Group and setting up Lily's new college fund with the $1,450 I was saving every month. When the digital assault failed, they moved to a physical siege. 3 days later, I looked out my window to see my father's car pulling into the visitor parking of my apartment complex. I felt a cold chill settle in my stomach as they walked toward my door. They weren't coming with legal documents. They were carrying an apple pie and a bouquet of grocery store lilies. I opened the door, but I didn't step back to let them in. I stood firmly in the threshold, my arms crossed. "Hannah, dear, you look so tired," my mother cooed, reaching out as if to pat my cheek. I tilted my head back, avoiding her touch. "We just wanted to drop by. We've missed you and Lily so much. This whole thing, it's just been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding, Mom," I said flatly. "Oh, of course it is," she insisted, her eyes welling up with tears that didn't quite reach her cheeks. "That Christmas night, Lily must have misunderstood. We weren't kicking her out. We were just worried about the seating and we thought she'd be more comfortable at home. It was all for her benefit, really." My father cleared his throat, shifting the weight of the apple pie. "Look, Hannah," he said, trying on his authoritative patriarch voice, though it sounded thin and reedy. "We've talked to our own advisors. We realize things got a bit heated, but we just need a bit more time. 60 days is impossible. We need 6 months, maybe a year, to get Kevin's business off the ground and find a suitable transition. You wouldn't want your own parents on the street, would you?" I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time in years. I didn't see the giants who had dominated my childhood or the parents I had spent $142,000 trying to please. I saw 2 aging people who were terrified. But they weren't terrified of losing their relationship with me or their granddaughter. They were terrified of losing their lifestyle. They weren't speaking to me as parents anymore. They were speaking like tenants trying to charm a landlord. They were negotiators trying to save a failing deal. "You had 7 years of my money," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "And you had 20 years of Ruth's. You had every opportunity to build a life that included your granddaughter, but you chose to build a fortress for yourselves and Kevin. The 60 days stands." "Hannah, please?" My mother cried, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "Think of Brandon. This is his home." "No," I replied, feeling a strange sense of finality. "It's Lily's home. And if you want to stay in a home that belongs to the girl you sent out into the snow, you'll have to talk to Mr. Mercer. I'm done being your administrator." As I closed the door, I didn't feel the crushing guilt I had expected. I felt light. For the first time, the fixer had fixed the only thing that actually mattered: her daughter's future. The 60-day deadline arrived with a silence that was more deafening than any argument. Despite the frantic calls, the tears, and the half-baked business plans Kevin threw at us, the clock didn't stop. When the calendar flipped to day 61, the legal grace period had officially expired. My parents had gambled on the hope that I would cave, that my good daughter instinct would override my maternal one. They were wrong. At 8 a.m. on the 61st day, a professional moving crew dispatched by Mercer and Hale and paid for by the trust pulled into the driveway of the Coeur d'Alene house. It wasn't a hostile eviction with police sirens. It was a clinical logistical extraction. I stood on the sidewalk with a clipboard watching, as the mahogany table, the one that didn't have a chair for my daughter, Bill, wrapped in moving blankets and wheeled out. My mother stood on the porch, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, clutching a designer vase as if it were the last piece of her dignity. My father sat on a packing crate, staring at the empty spot in the garage where his ego used to reside. The reality of their new life was a harsh downshift. Kevin, the man who had been preparing for a startup for over a decade, was forced to move into a cramped $1,100 a month apartment in a gritty part of Spokane. There was no basement palace there, only thin walls and the sound of traffic. To cover the immediate moving costs and a mountain of sports betting debt that had finally come due, my father was forced to sell his prized fishing boat. The $12,000 he got for it was gone within 48 hours, swallowed by the very credit card companies I had been paying off for years. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim her influence, my mother tried to go around me. She called Lily's cell phone repeatedly, leaving tearful messages about how Grandma misses her princess and how Mommy is being mean. But I had seen this play before. Before Lily could even hear the first ring, I had blocked the numbers of my parents, Kevin, and even Brandon from her phone. I wasn't being cruel. I was being a filter. I was ensuring that my daughter didn't have to carry the weight of their consequences. By the end of the week, the house was empty. The keys were handed over to me in a leather pouch. We met with Aunt Ruth one final time to sign the closing documents for the Lily Whitaker Heritage Trust. Ruth was as sharp as ever, her pen hovering over the final clause she had insisted upon. "This house is a sanctuary, not a liquid asset," Ruth said, looking at Lily, who was sitting quietly on the sofa reading a book. "The deed is now officially in Lily's name, but with a restriction: the property cannot be sold, mortgaged, or leveraged until Lily reaches the age of 25. Until then, Hannah, you will manage it. It will be a rental property, and every cent of the profit will go into Lily's education and trust." "And my parents?" I asked. "Your parents have been given the greatest gift I could offer," Ruth replied with a cold, thin smile. "The opportunity to finally live within their means. They are no longer beneficiaries of the Caldwell bloodline. They are simply citizens." The Whitaker family didn't just lose a house that day. They lost the myth of their own importance. They lost the ATM that had funded their arrogance, and they lost the daughter they had spent a lifetime taking for granted. A few weeks later, I took Lily to the house. It was empty and quiet, the sun streaming through the large windows and reflecting off the hardwood floors. Lily walked through the rooms, no longer a guest or an inconvenience, but the owner. She stopped at the dining room where the table used to be and looked at me. "Is it really mine, Mom?" she asked. "It is," I said, kneeling down to her level. "And this time, Lily, there is plenty of room for everyone who loves you." As we walked out and locked the door, I didn't look back at the $740,000 structure. I looked at the girl beside me. The ledger was finally balanced. 3 months later, the air in Coeur d'Alene had shifted from the biting frost of winter to the sweet, hopeful scent of a budding spring. I stood on the back porch watching Lily run across the lawn, her laughter echoing against the tall pines. She stopped suddenly, looking back at the house that had once been a fortress of exclusion, and walked over to me. "Mom?" she asked, her eyes wide and searching. "Is this really ours now? Like, for real? No one is going to tell us to leave?" I sat down on the steps and pulled her into a hug, the warmth of the sun finally matching the peace in my heart. "For real, Lily. This is your house. And as long as I'm here, you'll always have a seat at this table." The transformation wasn't just emotional, it was structural. With the $1,450 I was no longer sending to my parents, and the $120,000 Ruth had immediately diverted into Lily's educational trust, we began to reclaim the space. We didn't keep it as a shrine to my parents' arrogance. Instead, we scrubbed away the past. I repainted Lily's bedroom a vibrant, sunny yellow, replacing the dull beige she'd been told to stay quiet in. We tore down the rotting old porch railing and replaced it with sturdy cedar built to last. One Saturday afternoon, Lily insisted on planting a small apple tree in the center of the garden. She dug the hole herself, carefully patting the soil around the roots. "This is the new family tree," she declared, with the solemnity only an 11-year-old can muster. "It's going to grow big, and it's going to share its fruit with everyone who is kind." Ruth often came over in the afternoons. She would sit on the new cedar porch sipping Earl Grey tea and watching Lily play. She looked younger somehow, the weight of managing ungrateful relatives finally lifted from her shoulders. "You know, Hannah," she said one evening, watching the sunset dip below the lake, "justice is often painted as this complex, heavy thing, but sometimes it's remarkably simple. It's just putting the right things in the right hands." The chaos of the Whitaker family had faded into a distant static. There were no more fake holiday parties, no more frantic calls demanding loans for gambling debts or emergencies, and no more being treated like a human ATM. The silence was the greatest luxury I had ever owned. Lily finally had what she deserved from the very beginning, a home that didn't just house her, but cherished her. A family that didn't see her as an inconvenience, but as the future. So what do you think? Did I go too far by evicting the parents, or did I not go far enough to protect Lily's future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories of justice and family drama.